When we left off, we were predicting a crash. That crash has already begun, and it continues to go on all around us in slow motion. Some of the horrible things that are commonplace in our world, like school shootings, for example, weren't even an issue for your grandparents and your great-grandparents. Worse, it seems to be progressing quickly. So we'll follow the trail up to where we are today, and then give some potent Christian sources in response. Unlike postmodernism and its child critical theory, we can't be content with simply tearing things down. We need to build something up for ourselves and for the future. We need to find a strong foundation on which to plant our feet. What does this crashing process look like? It will have effects across a broad spectrum of society, from the grand to the mundane. We could talk about education, politics, art, philosophy, Netflix, fast food. Probably one place where we can trace a line most clearly is in the emerging reality of mass school shootings. Contrary to what you may have heard, school shootings in America are a relatively recent phenomenon. Almost every given instance of a school shooting prior to the 1980s involves some kind of personal grudge and few or no victims. This means, of course, that the location was often largely incidental. People weren't committing violence at schools simply because they were schools. The violence had other causes, and was incidental that it erupted where it did. The first instance you can generally find of an attack on a school with an intent to kill large numbers of students took place in 1927 when an insane Michigan man blew up a local school, but he clearly was the exception to the rule. Overwhelmingly, serious violence in schools was a minor issue and mass shootings almost unheard of through the 1970s. But then something changed. Starting in the 1980s, schools had to start installing metal detectors. Today, many students can legitimately wonder if their school will be the next target of a mass shooting. It seems to be able to happen anywhere. Even elementary schools are being attacked. While it's easy to blame all of this on emerging gun technology, and there is some truth in that because newer guns can kill more people more quickly, it is false to assume that guns themselves made the biggest difference. Guns have been plentiful in the United States since its founding, and even higher capacity repeating firearms were commonplace for more than 150 years. Guns were everywhere, but mass school shootings were not. While it is difficult to find any answer to a question like this with perfect scientific clarity, the most likely candidate was the shift in worldview that began in the 1960s and was largely complete in American culture by the 1990s and even entrenched by the 2000s. Before the 1970s, most Americans were raised with a very clear set of those moral guardrails derived from a Christian worldview, and therefore they valued human life, believed that committing crimes was wrong, and that murder was evil. For most of them, no matter how angry they got about something, the thought of killing innocent children and teens would never have been a realistic possibility. But then moral relativism became the norm and the guardrails began to come down. Let's think through school shootings from a true, morally relativistic point of view. If humans are really just accidents of nature, mere animals that happen to be here because of purposeless Darwinism, what actual, genuine, objective value do they have? Why should you even privilege them with any significance more than the cow that died for your Big Mac last week? You can throw up various answers to that, like, we should be true to our species. But the immediate response to anything is, why? Who says? That's just another opinion, and it's probably not even as good as mine. If there really is no good or evil, if there is no right or wrong, explain why murder is suddenly wrong. You might say that I could get caught, but what if I believe I can get away with it? That's no argument. Or if I'm suicidal and I just don't care if I get caught. It's not like there's even a God to hold me accountable after I'm dead. And on this view, no act is more good or evil than another, not even a school shooting. In short, if all of this is true, why not? The guardrails come down. Now, to be absolutely clear, I'm not implying that every person who believes in moral relativism is a mass-murdering monster. Many of them are wonderful, caring individuals and some of the nicest people you could wish to meet. The point is that no matter how nice they are, they can give no coherent, powerful reason why someone should choose to be nice and accepting instead of hateful and murderous. All they can say is, "I don't like it and neither do other people," and they have to hope that's enough. Increasingly, more and more individuals are calling that bluff. When you give people with no moral guardrails access to effective firearms and training, should we really be surprised to see them start actually using those firearms? Therefore, I don't think it was a coincidence that the major break upward in school shootings took place in the late 1980s and into the 1990s. The original 60s radicals talked a crazy game, but most of them came of age in a society with their guardrails intact. Their children, however, were increasingly raised from diapers on up with moral relativism as the norm at home, in the popular culture, and in school. So they started more and more to act in accordance with the worldview they were taught. Still don't see the connections. Consider the infamous Columbine killers, Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris, pictured right during their massacre. Notice the shirt Harris is wearing, emblazoned "Natural Selection." His diaries show that he believed himself to be the hand of Darwinism, the strong exterminating the weak. What's even worse is that now, in the absence of any moral guardrails or guidelines, while most people thankfully are more sensible, the killers have gained popularity and they have continued to grow a cult following. You can even buy the shirts online and wear them proudly. Some people have actually worn them in subsequent school shootings. Now again, this isn't to say that after postmodernism everyone is going to become a mass shooter. Clearly not. At the same time, the trend is clear. School shootings have gone from being essentially unthinkable to being virtually commonplace. So much so that there are shootings that aren't even reported on anymore in the national media. Take a moment and apply that same logic to moral situations other than shootings, albeit less dramatic ones. Are people more likely to lie, cheat, and steal today than they were before the advent of relativism, for instance? How have those kinds of changes affected society as a whole? As you can imagine, increasingly, people had a problem with it. You might think that after following this disastrous course for this long and seeing the consequences, that overall culture would take a deep breath and turn around. In the words of C.S. Lewis, when you've taken a wrong path, the person who turns around soonest is actually the most progressive. The good news is that an increasing number of people have actually started to do just that. Your families are probably among them, which is why you're here and not listening to the praises of relativism in a government school. The bad news is that a very large measure of the news, political, education, and entertainment elites have done nothing of the sort. In fact, many of them have doubled and even tripled down on failure. So, while postmodernism proper has largely passed out of official fashion, moral relativism is still resonating through our culture with direct consequences. The elites in media and academia, while still heavily influenced by the rudiments of postmodern thought, have tried to move on beyond it. What do you call it when you are beyond the thing that is beyond the modern? Is it a kind of postmodernism? And after that, do we get to postmodernism? Epi-postmodernism? Who the heck knows? They're still figuring it out. As they do, popular culture is playing catch-up, as it always does. They lag behind the cutting-edge elite. The result is a unique mix of thought that is as diverse as it is chaotic. We'll focus our last efforts on a famous mix of elite thinking and popular application that you might have already heard about: critical theory. Critical theory might be called son of postmodernism. Like postmodernism, it is a central set of ideals and goals that manifests itself differently in separate contexts. Most of the common public debate about it so far has centered around critical race theory, or CRT for short, in schools. While people mistakenly think of CRT as an end in and of itself, CRT is really just one manifestation of this much larger theory. Its champions want to see it spread to politics, literature, gender, science, and education too. Once again, a sort of anti-gospel. The goal is not just to change your mind about a few academic subjects. The goal is total societal and behavioral transformation. So if you've heard of CRT, keep it in mind, but remember that it's only a small part of the larger picture. Also, like postmodernism, critical theory takes relativism for its base. The main difference is that having discovered that it is impossible for everyone to practice their own truth, they are moving forward toward projecting their personal truth into the void. Drawing from Foucault and hard leftist German thinkers at the University of Frankfurt during World War II and after, they are creating a sort of sponsored secular arbitrary morality that will be enforced by sheer power. If nothing is really true, but we can't live without truth, then they believe it's up to society to fill that void, sort of like a loose rechanneling of the modernists. They propose a particular kind of hard atheistic leftism in particular. Remember where we said there was this previous contradiction between the way the postmodernists treated truth in general and how they treated their own. Everyone else's truth was relative and meaningless, while their own truth was absolute. Critical theory basically views and owns that contradiction, and they're proud of it. They don't see it as hypocrisy, they just see it as the way the world works. So, CT looks for power structures in society like Foucault did, with the assumption that the current structure is automatically evil and oppressive, particularly to racial and sexual minorities. It then focuses on tearing down those structures in order to liberate the specific oppressed minorities. It assumes that all social norms are constructed by one group to gain control over another, and they mean all. So the only reason violence or stealing or lying is a crime is because some oppressor class declared it so in order to oppress someone else. How do you fix it? You knock down the norms and you destroy the oppressive culture. Note, I did not say reform the culture, but destroy it. In some ways, this is a form of cultural genocide, but only practiced by approved groups against approved groups. It's important to note that while CT will appeal to truth when it finds it helpful, CT isn't about truth. The truth is just a tool to pursue a predetermined agenda and to get a predetermined result. Consider statistics, for example. If the numbers show that a preferred group is being oppressed, then CT adherents will trot the numbers out and use them to attack the oppressive culture, to prove their points. If, however, the numbers actually show that the preferred group isn't actually being actively oppressed, CT will then attack the numbers and deny that statistics is even a legitimate science. The goal isn't to determine the truth with science and math and whatnot and follow it where it leads. The goal is to push forward your particular agenda at all costs. If truth helps you get that, great. If not, the truth be damned. In this sense, even basic ideas of objective science, logic, and math are treated as a threat and even evil. You'll hear claims that will sound crazy, like math is racist, or that science is transphobic, for example. Yes, those are real things. That may seem odd until you realize that both good math and good science can actually find out clear truth, and truth gives you the ability to say yes or no to something. Critical theory doesn't like that. They want you to accept their agenda and their conclusions at all costs. If you can find out objective truth, you might determine that their claims are wrong and therefore not follow them. They don't want to take that chance. They just want you to agree with them no matter what. There's a kind of moral certitude in that assertion that is attractive to our current generations who are desperately looking for moral significance and actual meaning. They want to know that they matter. They want some solid ground to stand on, and they want some decent guidelines by which they can look at themselves and say, "We're the good guys." CT, with all of its empty moral posturing and loud proclamations, appeals straight to that desire. Unfortunately, CT is as arbitrary and empty as its predecessors. It's simply more violent in how it asserts itself. The distinguishing characteristics of CT are going to sound familiar for a simple reason. It's a culmination of all of the trends and movements we've spent so much time studying. Remember also that critical theory is a lot like postmodernism too, in that it isn't necessarily a coherent party so much as a vague movement. It did start as and still maintains a presence as a specific school of thought, the Frankfurt School, but it also has popularized itself into all kinds of different forms, and not all of them will focus on every single one of the following characteristics. Still, if you're on the lookout for them, you'll be better able to recognize its influence. First, and we need to say not much more about it, for CT, objective truth does not exist. We have beaten this horse into a fine crimson mist on the pavement. All facts, even scientific ones, are just social constructions that are used to oppress various minorities and people. This simply makes sense. If there is no higher God or fundamental reality, all life is just an accident and without meaning. When you take that line, it's not a big jump from morals and opinions to even science, dominated as it is by scientists with human perspectives. Logic and reason are equally invalid and human constructions. All that makes one thing right and another wrong is power. Whomever has the power to enforce their views onto others is right, and those who don't are wrong. Next, as we've come to expect, humans are nothing more than animals. We've mentioned many times now how this affects our opinion of human value, but it also affects what we think of human expectations and human behaviors. Humans aren't intelligent actors or even passionate, emotional creatures. They are simply meat computers whose actions are the results of their instincts. This further reinforces the power over reason dynamic, because if all people simply act on behavioristic instinct, then there's no point in trying to reason with them anyway. Reason has no effect, and reason is invalid. All you can resort to is raw force, just like dealing with an animal, whether direct or otherwise. The center point of all of this, like Marxism, is conflict. It's just instead of one specific kind of conflict, we have many different kinds. Marxism was all about class conflict over economics. CT is about class conflict over everything, but particularly conflict over race, conflict over class, and conflict over gender. That's one reason why this worldview is sometimes called neo-Marxism. The end result is that CT approaches each and every situation with a blind faith assumption that in every social interaction there is an oppressor and an oppressed. No relationship between human beings, therefore, can be truly mutually beneficial. Sometimes groups can change status between situations as various minority groups are categorized into a sort of hierarchy of oppression. So it can end up being quite confusing. For example, if the interaction is between a white man and a white woman, the woman is assumed to be the oppressed and the man the oppressor. If we switch it up and we say that it's a white woman interacting with an African American trans person, then the white woman is assumed to be the oppressor and the trans person the oppressed. The only way to avoid the oppressor designation is to fully, completely, and vocally express the preferred CT party line for that particular situation, and usually to denigrate your own self and others openly. Even then, it isn't always effective because after you do so, you might still be assumed to be harboring some unspoken race or gender bias, usually identified by an application of Derrida's imaginative deconstructive method. Given all of this, it shouldn't be surprising that CT is inherently destructive to everything that it touches, and even violent at times. It focuses on tearing down its specific targets by any means necessary. In the best case, they're happy to use research, proof, and evidence, but if that does not avail, they'll also fudge their results, resort to using logical fallacies as rhetorical cudgels, or even punishing opponents with contrary laws, as is the case with misgendering or hate laws that punish anyone who strays too far from their social agenda. For example, did you know that in Canada and Scotland you can be arrested and fined for even speaking disagreement with homosexuality or refusing to use someone's preferred pronouns? In the end, given the movement's emphasis on power above all else, it isn't about fairness or truth, but simple victory. Finally, as you might expect when dealing with a worldview that explicitly repudiates truth and is willing to attack even science, logic, reason, and math, it relies very, very heavily on emotion. It attempts to fill in the meaning gap that is created by its own premises by giving its adherents a sense of moral supremacy, guidance, and meaning. You are a good person who matters because you are engaging in this idealistic crusade to save people's lives and to create a better world than the one you inherited. You are the brave warrior standing up for the oppressed, attacking the oppressors, sacrificing yourself for those who cannot defend themselves. It therefore really functions like a practical religion for many, but in the worst sense of the word. Unlike traditional Christianity, which, as we've discussed, incorporates faith and reason as complementary partners, CT is sheer blind faith in action. Not only does it fail to offer reasonable evidence that it's true, it denies that truth and reason exist at all. It is accepted by a sheer act of preference and will. Therefore, when you disagree with its premises, for its defenders, this often isn't a rational discussion where you can sit down and treat all sides fairly. The mere fact of disagreement makes the person with a different opinion evil, and they will be treated that way. Just spend a few minutes on social media if you need any further examples. Sound crazy? This really is a big part of the world we have around us, and various forms of these ideals have infiltrated all aspects of Western life. It can be found in both political parties and even in many churches. Take this list of characteristics and keep it handy as you binge TV, go to the movies, or surf social media. For years now, critical theory's brand of moralist teaching has been the norm and even overt in many movies and shows, from NCIS to House to Doctor Who to the MCU. You might be surprised to see how often these themes crop up. If that all seemed exhausting, we're not done yet. Thankfully, the end of our story is not all doom and gloom. We'll spend the rest of our year looking at some of the alternatives that Christianity has to offer us, and thankfully, there is much to be hopeful for and to hope in. The biblical Christian worldview has proved itself to be historically strong in all the places where the world is currently weak. If we take the time to mature in our faith and really dig into and understand it, we'll find a firm foundation on which to rest our feet. Now, what follows is a massive oversimplification, for which I apologize in advance. If you hark back to our very first talk, you'll remember that we said that the secular worldview cuts itself off at the neck, choosing to base itself on nothing more substantial than humanity itself. Over the year, we've seen that humanity is far too fragile a foundation upon which to build. It is very much sand. We've watched it crumble and fall in on itself with some disastrous consequences. The Christian worldview is based on a reality that is fundamentally deeper than even the whole physical material universe. That gives us a grounding that is firm and strong. Because of God's creative process, nature, and Christ's sacrifice, Christians see profound meaning in each and every human life. Every human that has ever lived, specifically you and I, have value, and we definitely matter, very much so. We matter enough that the Son of God endured unimaginable torture to right our relationships with the Father and bring us back into the family. Better, our salvation isn't a hypothetical possibility. We have a direct means of salvation and a specific understanding of how to accept it. A reality bigger than ourselves, outside ourselves, has other important results. It means we have grounds to believe in objective truth, objective morality, and a basis for genuine reason and actual science. All of those things gain value and clarity because they are grounded in something bigger than this entire universe. Premeditated, unprovoked murder or rape is wrong not because somebody didn't like the way it felt or just preferred it that way, but because murder is wrong, rape is wrong, and morality is grounded in God's nature outside time and space. Neither of these things will change because of preference or situation or some off-the-cuff justification. Finally, all of the desperation for connection we experience isn't an accident either. We were created for community, just like God Himself is in community with Himself and with us. That allows us to build a society with meaningful connections to others, and in which we can find value. There is so much more to say, and I would be happy to talk through more of it with you if you need to. But the long and short of it is that the Christian worldview gives us what we need to matter and to know truth. We do still struggle with the sin nature, and this world is very messy. That means there will sadly be much grief and betrayal mixed in with our joy. But we can look at the world and know that we have that firm foundation so many others are desperately searching to find. From the beginning of the year, we've plunged through one attempt to find value, truth, and meaning after another. All that humanity, in the West at least, seems to have accomplished is to dig its grave deeper and deeper, and then drag more and more people down into it. Every new turn seemed to bring with it some different and exciting form of insanity, but the only progress we seemed to be making was in how effective we were at killing each other. If you truly believe you have no alternative, then it should be easy to understand why people might fall into despair and cynicism. Schaeffer's line of despair is a real thing, and we've seen it in action. Thankfully, there is a real and meaningful alternative, and that brings us to our reading in the book of Matthew. There is only one actual alternative to the insanity, and that's the gospel. The word, of course, means literally good news. Many Americans have heard it recounted so many times, and they have lived for so long in such physical comfort, that they tend to forget that that's what it really means. But put yourself into the minds of many of the authors we've studied. Think about the reality of human sin and human evil. Think about all the evil things that you have done in your life and that other people have done to you. All the things that you would normally try to forget. Think about the weight and the burden of all of that and the place to which they are dragging you. Now, as you sink under that weight, consider the historically objective truth that the matter is Jesus Christ, the second person of the Trinity and the Son of God, willingly came into this universe as a real person in real history and died the most painful death known to humanity to free you from those sins and that burden. His sacrifice is righting all that we know and that we feel is wrong with the world and with ourselves, and it opens us to adoption as sons and daughters of the Father. That is very good news indeed. As you read through Matthew this Holy Week, don't simply do so as another Sunday school exercise just because you have to do it. Think back on all the readings and the studying that we've done, and then approach it fresh. You might be surprised exactly how good the good news actually is. G.K. Chesterton was a famous and very prolific English journalist in the early part of the 20th century, right at the height of optimism for progressive modernism. He wrote dozens of witty essays and books defending the Christian point of view and Christian civilization. He himself said he would write a book at the drop of a hat and at the least provocation from his critics, who included some of the most famous atheists and secular thinkers of his day. And, as you'll soon find out, if you read him fairly, he generally gave far better than he got. He was one of the early influences on C.S. Lewis, who read Chesterton with pleasure, and if you're interested in Lewis, seriously, one of your next steps is to find out more about Chesterton. In his book Orthodoxy, Chesterton says that he is making a defense of everything. It is his apologetic, explaining to his audience why he believes the things that he does and why he holds the central tenets of Christianity to be far superior to anything the modernist worldview, or postmodernist by implication and connection, has to offer. As you read it, bear in mind a few things. First, this is not a specifically scholarly effort. Chesterton isn't pretending to be an expert in philosophy or theology, and he isn't writing to experts. He is one intelligent, normal person addressing other interested people. Second, he is explicit that this isn't a technical or systematic defense of the faith. Yes, it's full of logic, it's overflowing with logic, but he is not relying on logic alone. He is also appealing to his audience's understanding, experience, and feelings. In short, Chesterton is speaking to the whole person, not just to a part of it. Further, he isn't attempting to answer every possible question that could be asked. This is the story of how he himself came to faith and to understand that Christianity was the answer to the questions that the world has been asking. If you'd like to delve into something more formal or more systematic, I would suggest the works of philosophers like Alvin Plantinga or William Lane Craig. This isn't to put down Chesterton in any way. His book is brilliant and wide-ranging. Better, many of his arguments hold just as much water today as they did during his lifetime. After reading all the heavy-hitting worlds of literature and philosophy and science, you might be surprised when you pick up Wendell Berry's Hannah Coulter. At first glance, it might not seem to fit into the overall flow of things we've been studying. Berry is a literature professor, author, poet, and all-round advocate for a more natural country way of living. His books about life and relationships in and around the fictional town of Port William, Kentucky, are a refreshing breath of air for many. The book itself is a fictional autobiography of Hannah Coulter as she navigates life in the modern and later postmodern worlds and consistently makes decisions to stay connected to her friends and family and the land around her. The relation to our topics of discussion, therefore, actually couldn't be stronger. The defense of the Christian faith and an understanding of how to move forward in the modern world would not be complete without a sense of community and its value. Hannah watches many of the technologies and temptations we deal with emerge around her. She faces crippling grief and experiences lasting, abiding joys, and through it all we see her strong connection to those around her pull her through. It emphasizes the importance of community and the threat of its loss. While not at all preachy, we also see in Hannah her deep trust in God and what she thinks is a better way of doing things. Why is this important? The world around us is, and has been for decades, almost intentionally designed to rip communities and relationships apart. People are constantly on the move from place to place from graduation onwards, and many even before that. This puts strain on family relationships and makes the building of deep, mutually supportive community ties almost impossible. That leaves us, as citizens and believers, sort of hung out to dry, facing the entire world on our own. And yet that kind of community is exactly what Christians are called to build. Further, in a world that is increasingly dangerous in general and hostile in particular to Christians, local community will become more and more important. Berry reminds us to be intentional about it and to be, in that sense, very much countercultural. And can you believe it? This brings us to the very end of all our readings. not just for TGC 6, but for your entire TGC experience. I say and I mean with no melodrama that this is a solemn moment. For some of you, 6 years of your life have led you to this instant. You've seen the flow of human thought grow from the oldest records to which we have access through thousands of years of history to our very own time. You've considered the ideas of some of the greatest thinkers in all of human history, and not simply the ones that your teachers would prefer you to emulate. This isn't something that most college and even graduate school graduates can say that they've done, let alone high school seniors. You are due an incredible amount of credit for your hard work and your effort. My hat is off to you. At the same time, this moment brings with it a decision. You've seen and studied the paths that you have before you. You've seen where they come from and have a much better idea than most where they're likely going. You've ground your heels into the foundations built by these various worldviews, and you know something of the strength and weakness of them all. The decision is now yours. Which path will you choose? Secular or Christian? Trying to avoid a choice, which you may well have done so far in your life, is still a choice in itself, really. And as you leave home and begin to forge your own way forward, you will find yourself on one path or the other. You cannot serve 2 masters. The consequences are literally eternal. You have the tools you need to decide well, and my prayers and those of every one of us at Wilson Hill are with you. May you choose wisely.